Welcome to this explainer. We tend to think of trains today as just, well, a way to get from point A to point B. But back in the 19th century, laying down those iron tracks wasn't just about transportation. It unleashed this massive ripple effect that fundamentally rewired society, totally changed how we keep time, and even sparked a new wave of human liberation from the ground up. It literally touched absolutely every aspect of daily life. But before we get into all that, we really have to consider the absolute shock of the new. The actress Fanny Kemble was just completely entranced by this, calling it a magical machine. But hey, not everyone shared her enthusiasm. Some of the most eminent scientists of the day actually feared that traveling at the unimaginable speed of 60 miles per hour would stop cows from giving milk, turn sheep black from the smoke, or get this, permanently damage passengers' eyes because they wouldn't be able to adjust to the motion. It was a truly terrifying plunge into the unknown. So here is how we're going to break this down today. 1. The plunge into the unknown. 2. Rewiring a nation. 3. Cathedrals of steam. And 4. The rise of solo travel.
All right, let's jump right into part 1, the plunge into the unknown, building the iron network. Just look at how fast this idea spread like wildfire. We go from literally a single public steam railway at Stockton and Darlington in 1825 to completely connecting England and Scotland just 2 decades later in 1846. It is absolutely staggering how fast this infrastructure was laid down, especially when you remember they were doing all of this without modern mechanical earth movers. So you have to ask, who actually did all this heavy lifting? Well, to understand the human cost, we have to talk about an incredibly elite, hard-drinking workforce known as the navvies. These guys were a world apart from your standard agricultural laborer. A typical navvy was putting away an unbelievable 2 pounds of beef and a whole gallon of beer every single day. I mean, no way, right? But they needed that just to survive the grueling, deadly labor. In fact, it took a regular farm worker an entire year of training just to build up the physical stamina to qualify as a navvy. They lived in atrocious, crowded camps, wore these distinctive moleskin trousers, and did incredibly dangerous work, often losing their lives to careless accidents with explosives.
Okay, moving right along to section 2, rewiring a nation, time commutes, and fish and chips.
The before and after contrast here is just wild. Picture this, a 31-mile journey, like the one between Liverpool and Manchester, that used to take all day by stagecoach, totally at the mercy of unpredictable weather. Suddenly, it takes just a couple of hours. This unbelievable leap in speed created a massive boom in commuter travel. By the 1860s, you start seeing cheap workmen's trains and even seaside excursion trips for the working class. To put it into perspective, by 1854, nearly 100 million people were riding the rails every single year. Now, you might be wondering, how did people keep track of time before this? Well, it was chaos. Towns just used their own local mean time based on the sun. But when you have massive metal machines hurtling towards each other at 60 miles per hour, chaotic local time zones are a literal recipe for disaster. So trains actually invented our modern concept of synchronized time. On December 11th, 1847, British railroads adopted standard railway time, which is Greenwich Mean Time. By forcing the whole country onto a single synchronized clock, the trains literally synchronized society, a real game changer. But wait, it gets even crazier. The rails had these incredible, unpredictable side effects. All of a sudden, city dwellers had fresh milk and meat delivered daily. Fish and chips, which honestly used to just be a quirky seaside novelty, could be transported inland fast enough that it became a national dish. And if you're a sports fan, you can thank the railways for professional football leagues. For the first time ever, teams and their supporters could actually travel across the country for away games. It completely rewired the cultural diet of the nation. Let's dive into section 3, Cathedrals of Steam, the built environment.
The railway companies knew the public was kind of terrified of this noisy, sparking new tech, so they built absolutely magnificent spaces to calm their nerves. Take Euston Station's stunning Great Hall, which opened in 1849. Sadly, it was controversially demolished in 1962. But why build something so incredibly grand just to sell train tickets? Because they needed to reassure people. They wanted to prove that this industrial technology was safe, permanent, and culturally respectable. These buildings were quite literally cathedrals of steam. To really sell that respectability, architects leaned heavily on comfortable, historical styles. You can clearly see the contrast here between the Tudor style on one side and the classical style on the other. By wrapping these massive, intimidating transport hubs in familiar, historic aesthetics, They blended them right into their surroundings. It was basically a brilliant psychological trick to mask the terrifying iron machines lurking inside.
And honestly, the absolute pinnacle of this ambition has to be the Gothic masterpiece of St. Pancras. I mean, wow, just look at this dramatic exterior. This wasn't just a station, it was a luxury hotel designed by George Gilbert Scott that proudly put the monumental wealth, pride, and power of the Midland Railway Company right on display for everyone to see. It screamed success and permanence.
What's super fascinating to me about this building is how it literally captures the tension of the whole era in one spot. If you look closely where the two styles meet in the middle, you have the architect's highly decorative, historical red brick arches clashing directly against the engineer's completely modern, blue-painted iron train shed. It's art meeting heavy industry in one physical space, perfectly showing that messy transition between the old world and the modern era. Finally, let's hit Section 4, the rise of solo travel, societal liberation. So here's a massive question for us to ponder. How on earth did a purely industrial transportation network, one that was built basically to move coal and cotton around, end up altering the incredibly strict social boundaries and gender roles of Victorian society? You gotta remember, back then, an unmarried woman traveling alone wasn't just unusual, it was completely scandalous, sometimes even unsafe. Women were heavily tied to these strict ideals of domesticity and almost always required a male chaperone just to protect their reputation. But suddenly, the safety, speed, and enclosed nature of train travel provided this sudden, highly respectable escape route from the domestic sphere. This physical infrastructure actually birthed the whole archetype of the new woman. Almost overnight, educated, independent women could travel solo for leisure or intellectual growth without facing total social ruin. The railways gave them a sanctioned, safe space, and that massive shift laid the historical groundwork for the huge solo female travel industry we see today, from backpackers all the way to travel bloggers. And we see this so perfectly with absolute trailblazers of the time, like Isabella Bird and Mary Kingsley. They utilized this exact new travel infrastructure to kick off incredibly daring, unchaperoned journeys to places like the Rocky Mountains and West Africa. They wrote these wildly popular books about their adventures, and in doing so, they completely shattered the Victorian myth that women were just too fragile or delicate to explore the world on their own. Which brings us to a pretty massive final thought. The Victorian Railway was built to move freight, right? But it unexpectedly synchronized time, invented commuter suburbs, popularized fish and chips, and catalyzed women's independence. It really makes you wonder, as we lay down the digital tracks and AI networks of the 21st century, what invisible societal barriers are today's technologies quietly dismantling right now? What is our ripple effect going to be? Think about that for a second. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.